Okay. Hi, everybody. Firstly, many thanks to Alex Winters for the invitation to speak here in the context of the History of Creative Time Summit. I was asked to reflect on the e-flux project called Time Bank, which I originally presented at the third edition of this event in 2010, and to relate this to my more current work. I appreciate the incentive to rethink something I have done in the past and to try to connect it with what I'm working on now. And actually, this made me notice a certain thread that I was not aware of before. Around 2008, some months before the world financial crisis was officially acknowledged, Julieta Aranda and I started noticing that a lot of new pawn shops started opening on the Lower East Side and in some parts of the East Village. Pawn shop as in the places where you pawn valuables in order to get like a short-term loan or something like that. I grew up in the East Village and Lower East Side and went to school there. e-flux has been physically located in a small storefront on Ludlow and Essex Street for a long time, so this kind of changes on the street stood out. The business structure of a pawn shop, an ancient and a very peculiar enterprise that feeds on misfortune and misery, seemed archaic and interesting. Julieta and I decided to transform e-flux storefront into a pawn shop for objects of art. We meant this humorously. There were all sorts of surreal and unusual encounters with audiences. For example, when the police showed up to look for stolen goods, only to find conceptual artworks instead. It was interesting and challenging to try to explain to the cops that a ring or a guitar is actually not a ring or a guitar, but a work of art. We were largely unaware that a huge financial calamity, the ramifications of which are still affecting politics all across the globe, is just around the corner. In the following months, as the banks and investment houses started to collapse and the economic situation rapidly deteriorated, we started noticing that for many artists participating in this project, the symbolic fee we were offering to pawn their artworks was actually not so symbolic, because the economy of many artists living in the city is so fragile. This was really disheartening. We announced a fake bankruptcy and closed shop. Partly in response to what we learned from running the pawn shop, Julieta and I were very excited to come across a concept of time banking, a community-based form of an alternative economy and currency rooted in utopian socialist and anarchist tradition of the 19th century, and influenced by the economic theories of the British socialist Robert Owens and American anarchist Josiah Warren, who were both developing a labor theory of value. To test these theories, in the late 1800s, Josiah Warren opened the Cincinnati Time Store, a shop where you could trade goods and services using time as currency. The way this worked is that, for example, you could trade your labor as a carpenter for a bushel of wheat, or your work as a dressmaker for something else that you need without using money. Josiah Warren, 100 years later, in the early 1990s, this concept was adopted by the activist Paul Glover in Ithaca, New York, who organized the first contemporary time bank during the economic downturn at the beginning of the Clinton presidency. Paul issued an alternative currency called Ithaca Hours. At the peak of Ithaca Time Bank, local banks in Ithaca started accepting this currency on par with dollars. So what I'm showing you very quickly is prototypes for our time bank's currency, and this is the one that we actually ended up issuing. Time banking is based on trust. Usually time banks do well in small communities where people know and trust each other. For us, the challenge and the experiment in this project was to see if this could work in the art community on an international scale. We wanted to see if people in the arts can organize to make better use of all the skills, resources, and knowledge that exist in the art community, similarly to mutual aid societies in other fields, in order to address the scarcity and the precariousness inherent to many artists' lives, which we observed while we were running the pawn shop. Over the course of 5 years, we started nearly a dozen branches of Time Bank in different cities: New York, Moscow, Frankfurt, The Hague, Gwangju, and many others. Most of them were connected to art exhibitions and were temporary. In order to make the concept of time banking more accessible, we set up several time stores. as well as a series of canteens called Time Food, where you could exchange time for a cooked meal. We issued a time currency denominated in minutes and set up a rather elaborate website as a central exchange of the time bank. We ended the project around 2012, partly out of exhaustion. However, one of the branches still exists. It's a time bank at The Hague in Holland. At this point, this branch is fully independent and autonomous from the original project. They don't view it as an artwork or as something particular to the art community, and are still very, very active. So now, the second part, a darker and more dystopian vision, here we go, of the idea of time-based economy and social order can be observed in a science fiction movie called In Time, which was released around the same time as our project.
Survival of the fittest.
So this is a little clip from this film. Probably most of you have seen it.
Just to bribe our way in here. Let's see what it got us. Quality time. Really is a man with a million years.
It's my first million. It won't be my last.
You know how much good it could do?
I know how much.
Okay, we can turn the lights back on.
Try to understand.
Here the idea is that in the future, humans are genetically reprogrammed to stop aging in their early 20s. All the diseases and natural causes of death have been genetically removed as well, and people are essentially immortal. Other than they have to earn time to keep on living minute by minute. Otherwise, they simply die when their time runs out. Time is stored in vaults and circulated as currency. There are time billionaires who are immortal, while the majority of the population is struggling to stay alive. It didn't occur to me until now that the next 5 years of my research and work are directly related to exploring this dimension of time, following the utopian philosophy of Russian cosmism, through a series of films, publications, and symposia. Around the same time as Josiah Warren's economic and social experiment, a librarian in Moscow, Nikolai Fedorov, proposed that our common task as thinking beings should be to become immortal, resurrect everyone and everything that has ever lived, and explore and travel in outer space. Around 1924, one of the followers of these ideas, a Marxist theorist, medical doctor, and a co-founder with Lenin of the Bolshevik Party, whose name is Alexander Bogdanov, set up an institute in Moscow for the study of blood transfusions and the first blood bank in the world. His theory was that exchanging blood between young people and old people one would be able to slow down aging process and achieve rejuvenation for the elderly. In other words, redistribute time, as well as to redistribute antibodies and immunity from diseases that the old could offer to the young, and to make this available to the entire population of the Soviet Union by setting up a network of blood banks and transfusion facilities throughout the country. His experiments ended tragically in his own death from a blood transfusion, from blood poisoning, resulting from a transfusion with a student who was ill with malaria. It seems Bogdanov thought that he was immune to malaria and wanted to share his immunity with the student, so they exchanged blood. The student lived, but Bogdanov died. However, in principle, it seems that Bogdanov's theories were correct. Many of our contemporary drugs are synthesized from immunities found in certain individuals, and it seems that some of the California techno-billionaires are already heavily investing in the biotechnology of longevity and immortality, and some of it through blood transfusions of plasma from teenagers, like Peter Thiel, for example. And this is the scary thing. If a longer lifespan, even immortality, will become only available to billionaires, oligarchs, political elites, and those who control power in our societies, then, like in the science fiction film, the rest of us will struggle even more and will exist even more precariously on borrowed time. We will need to sell or pawn our blood and our organs for the rejuvenation of the rich and powerful. Many people already do so, very tragically, in Syria, India, Sri Lanka, Kazakhstan, Moldova, Ukraine, Brazil, Egypt, Philippines, Turkey, and other places. This is why I feel it's important and urgent to insist not only on Medicare for all, but to demand immortality for all. Thank you very much.